2. Old Fighters, New Wars. When Clay's help called me out of my bedchamber and I stumbled down into the dining hall, I was treated to a veritable feast. It was not Green Clay who hosted me, however, but rather his eldest nephew, Roland, who had been sent to receive me in his stead. The elder Clay had fallen ill, he said, but he assured me he was prepared to make my stay a productive and lucrative one. We had much to do, and I didn't dally. After the long road north, I sucked down the savory salt pork and biscuits like a starving dog, and before long I found myself in a sitting room across from Roland filling a pipe for what would turn out to be a long talk. We were soon joined by 2 others who'd arrived in the wake of the meal, both locals as it turned out, there to better illustrate the woes of the town. The first one was Brom Van Dyer, a fair-haired, lanky doctor who practiced along Irvine's main street. As I came to understand it, he owned a fair bit of farmland in the valley, and was an avid hunter. His livestock had been some of the first to suffer under the strangeness which befell the town, and his attempts to drive out the thing responsible had led him to more questions than answers. The Dutchman was so tall he bent his head passing through door frames, and his keen eyes seemed the sort which had seen, and solved, many problems. Yet there was a shaky unease about Van Dyer, and I noticed that when he selected a chair in the cozy sitting room, he ensured his back was to a corner and kept his gaze toward the exits. The other was Zachary Walker, an older, stocky man with a shaved head and thick spectacles that made his eyes look wild. He didn't walk so much as he stomped. When he wheeled into the room on muddy boots, heedless of the carpet and the polished floors, the same doorman who'd shown me in last night was on his heels, offering to relieve him of the heavy, antiquated blunderbuss he carried over his shoulder. He bluntly informed the man that he, and I quote, wouldn't so much as fuck his wife without a gun on him. Roland Clay looked mortified. Brom Van Dyer seemed resigned, and I must have looked like a tickled child by the time he slid down into a chair and demanded tobacco from his dumbfounded host, which he received. When his scowl had subsided, Clay looked to me, nodding briskly as if to shake an annoying memory free from his skull. "As you know, there are strange things afoot in Irvine," he said, tone cool as the grave. "My uncle would not have sent for you if the matter wasn't serious. My friends here have both experienced it firsthand. But first, I should fill you in on what's been going on." Clay laid out how the first weird murmurs had crept into the hills around town last autumn. Young children in the rugged log cabins and ramshackle farmhouses which ringed Estill County's outskirts were becoming restless, plagued by unwholesome dreams of quiet midnight forests, and the things which wandered through them. I tried to keep my nerves steady as he described how the children had been dismissed at first, right up until the parents started jolting from sleep to escape the very same dreams. What's more, cattle and pigs had been found slaughtered in their pens and barns, and wildlife on the outskirts of town was being mauled by something far too bloodthirsty to be a big black bear, fattening up before a hard winter. It was hardly touching the meat, this thing which struck in the night, and for all the efforts to track it, the thing seemed to leave no spore in its wake. By the time Irvine found itself in the depths of the last winter, some had begun to tell that things were stranger than bad dreams and hunters who refused to eat. John Ball, whose pigs had been nearly wiped out in the late fall, had sworn during the first snows in December of that year that he awakened from one of his strange nightly visions to find a figure outside his window. Ball had said the dream ended outside the simple front window of his cabin, and it had been so real to him that when he rose from bed he probed out into the dark front room to be sure nothing was amiss. Watching his 3 sleeping children who lay along the floor in the silver light of the moon which spilled through into the cabin was a towering figure who hunched upon the swineherd's front porch. The sheen of the fire on the dirty old window was enough to obscure the details, but when the figure drew back and fled for the woods, Ball went to the door to watch. Against the blue sheen of the nocturnal snow, he spied a loping, bipedal, bulky thing, whose thick arms seemed too long and whose capering stride seemed too clumsy to belong to something so dreadfully quiet. Yet, when the sun craned its wary head above the hilltops and he dared to look for tracks in the snow, Ball found none. This led many to doubt he'd seen anything at all, right up until his whole family went missing. A party had been dispatched to see him after a neighbor had found the cabin door blown in and the interior in bloody disarray. Gore stained the ratty carpets and Ball's bed had been overturned, yet nothing of value had been moved. Ball's rifle and the small stash of salt and silver he kept had been left unmolested. When the party searching for him went into the dense woodland around the farmstead, they eventually found the old, time-dried carcasses of Ball's pigs twisted and strung up in the trees, in mockery of crucified men, most believed. On the ridge overlooking the property was Ball himself, along with his wife and children. These three had been treated in similar fashion, gouged and clawed before being hoisted aloft to hang like scarecrows in the cool air. I thought to the bear on the trail I'd seen. I asked Clay about it, and he confirmed they'd been finding similar totems all through the past year. So bad had it become that there was nary an unmolested hill in the county, and each played host to whatever the thing which stalked the trees had seen fit to slaughter and string up. Perhaps string up isn't the best phrase, though, for these effigies were always free of string or rope, held aloft by driving branches and stumps through the limbs of the dead. Brom Van Dyer weighed in, giving me the details on the wounds as he'd seen them. They were animal marks, he thought, but he couldn't square that away with the way the corpses had been hung up in the trees or the account Ball had given before his death. Other than blood, no hair, broken limbs, or even disturbed snow had been left to set the searchers on the path to finding the culprit, and they'd been left defeated in the cold. Irvine had drawn in on itself, with families boarding together and taking up armed watches in the windows and doorways, as if they were far western settlers faced with the prospect of barbarous Comanche raids. Livestock continued disappearing, and dreams continued to hound the populace. When the Weston farm was sacked in the night in January, it was without warning, and the only reason any had found out about the happening at all is because a battered teenage youth had crawled through the winter chill into downtown Irvine the next morning with the soles of his feet chewed clean off. He'd been a field hand for the Westons, and bled out from a nasty gash through his thigh soon after being brought into Van Dyer's care. The boy told them the family had been shooting at something which walked the tree line after dark for the past several nights, and that they couldn't sleep for fear of the nightmares they suffered. This something had torn the men on guard to pieces before midnight, and seemed unconcerned by the sting of their guns. He said it had raided the farmhouse, knocked in one of the walls, and rent the family within using great claws. When asked what it was, the teenager could give no answer. He could only mutter that it was no man. They never found out how he'd escaped, but I had my ideas. That trick with the feet was nothing new to me. Zachary Walker, who had been pulling deeply from a flask as the tales wore on, pitched in before I could get the words out. "I've seen Chickasaw savages do the same thing, back in the old days," he said. "Maim the survivor and send him crawling for town so the locals know who did it, and can steer clear of him accordingly." I nodded my agreement. The chittering Seminole down in Florida had been fond of cutting grooves into the flesh of the calf muscle, so that their chosen survivor could stagger home through the murk and grime of the swamp only to die of the festering wounds a week later. The legs would go black, and the veins would throb like snakes beneath the skin as the worst of the infection set in. Seeing a couple men put through that had been enough to make every one of us vow never to be taken alive. The tale didn't end there, of course. Travelers into the region had been sparse, and though it was initially assumed traffic was light due to the remarkable cold of that year, it was soon discovered that several trappers who often wintered in the hills near Irvine had been killed and left displayed along the roads into the county. The winter slipped by with all the urgency of a passing glacier, and each dragging week brought more reports of deer, bears, or livestock hung up to rot in the trees. Children were particularly susceptible to the hunters' predations. 2 youngsters from the Hyde family who dwelt in the rugged eastern reaches of the county had run off under the stark light of noonday to see to their dog, which the household had all heard yipping and whining in the woods. Fearing the animal had fallen afoul of a trap, the boys insisted on going out to help. The menfolk of the Hyde family told them not to go far, but the boys took a rifle, and the brightness of the crisp day seemed to dismiss any worries they might have had about the wood. After all, the thing had never stricken save in darkness. It was only when the Hydes realized their old dog was sound asleep upon the floor of their warm barn an hour later that they began to worry. They called up all the houses around to search, but by sundown no trace of the lads had been found, and the people scuttled back to their homes like beasts for the safety of their burrows. They all knew what the darkness held, and the Hyde boys were assumed lost with the fall of night. In the pale light of the following morning, Ida Taylor, a girl of 6 on the opposite end of the county, was drawn from her morning chores in the kitchen into the tall grass of the field beside her home. She'd told her elder sister she had heard the mewling of newborn kittens in the brush. She never returned, and when her parents found out she had wandered off and took up the search, the results were much the same. In the late afternoon, as the surrounding families were beginning to head home, 3 teenage boys of the Wilson household had heard a child's sobs in the depths of a small ravine in the hills, and all but one had refused to go in after them. The gulch was dark, made all the darker by the slow setting of the sun above the trees, and there was a foul odor about the quiet place. The only noise to be heard other than the sobs was the soft trickle of a languid stream which traced the floor of the ravine. The Wilsons gave their only rifle to their eldest brother and watched as he scrambled and slid into the shadows some 80 or 90 feet below, calling out and never receiving anything in return save more of the harrowing sobs. The boys reported a full 5 minutes passed after their brother had slipped out of view amidst the stone before the sobs died away and the shot rang out. Then, that same damnable silence fell over the gulch. The younger Wilson boys were left to call and shout to a brother who would not answer them. At least, not at first. After a minute or so of building panic, they heard their brother's voice, but it was not in answer to their calls. Instead, the elder Wilson would not speak. He merely sobbed and groaned like a wounded animal, and the younger boys found the sound so uncanny that they turned tail and fled for help rather than follow their brother into the dark. A party of 20 armed men had gone into the moon-crazed woodland to find the ravine, but when the boys led them to it, and they scoured it by lantern and torch in the dark, they found it empty. The only trace of those who'd come before was the Wilson family's rifle, left lying where it had been dropped on the muddy floor of the gulch. The bodies of these 4 missing youths would all be found the following morning on a gnarled old oak tree which grew along the modest main street of Irvine, just within the front gate of Van Dyer's own stately home. The soft flesh beneath their chins had been run through with tree limbs, and the 4 corpses had all been left to hang by the jaws like fresh fish in the chill air. Their wounds were ragged and far from uniform. The girl had been disemboweled, the teenager raked across the throat, and the 2 young boys had had limbs plucked or carved off them as if they were spiders which had fallen prey to a twisted child. It was then that militias were called up and the hills were scoured. Men of the surrounding counties had poured in with the intention of killing anything dangerous in the knobs, and the town fell into a defensive stillness as if siege had been laid upon the place. But while they found a few more corpses of the missing in the hills, and turned up a great many butchered animals. There were no more killings that winter, and by the time spring had come and gone with nothing to show for their efforts, Irvine and the surrounding country reluctantly went back to business as usual. Parents still kept their children close, and watches were still raised in the night. But pre-dawn feedings started up again for the livestock, and families became less frightened to let light spill through their windows after dark. Through all that calm resurgence, the dreams had never stopped. Even when the warmth of summer graced the meadows with gleaming goldenrod, and the pokeweed hung thick with its alluring poison fruit along the winding dirt roads through the mountains, the muggy nights were filled with tossing and turning. First a holler on one side of Irvine might complain of restless nights and strange visions of the nightmare woods, and then another. And by the time July had come and gone, there was not a soul in town who didn't have some anecdote to recount about an eerie vision they'd had, wherein they watched their own sleepy farmhouses from amidst the trees like wolves, sizing up prey. General Green Clay himself hadn't been spared this harrowing experience. On visiting the town he'd founded back in August to oversee the construction of a mill on one of his properties along the riverfront, he'd boarded in his local residence. In the very same house in which we smoked and fidgeted and murmured about unthinkable things in the woods, General Clay had awoken from a dream screaming. He'd told the staff that something had been hanging ape-like from the lip of the grand porch outside his second-story window. The general's nightmare had shown him the long and winding approach his nocturnal visitor had taken, bounding through forests and across pastures to clamber up and leer into his window with eyes that caught the scant candlelight like coal stirring in an old fireplace. This shock was, his nephew Roland believed, partly to blame for his uncle's recent illness. So great had the strain of the fright been for him that he was pulled out of Irvine by carriage the following week to seek medical aid in the city. Roland, having been summoned to observe on the family's behalf in his stead, had then borne witness to the things which had happened upon Herder's Ridge in the first week of September, just after I'd received my summons in distant Tennessee. After a night of particularly bad dreams, a company of trappers who'd camped just south of Herder's Ridge awoke before dawn to screams which crept down to them through the trees, barely audible above the crushing weight of the canopy. The night was so still and the air so foul with stench that they dared not move. More troubling still was the fact that they'd all shared the same dream, and they all wagered they knew what was happening to the little cluster of time-worn farmsteads atop the ridge. Their visions had been through the eyes of something capering about on the rooftops of those farmsteads in the silent night air, leaning down over the eaves to glimpse sleeping shapes through the windows. When dawn broke and the stink abated, the armed band of trappers pushed up onto the ridge and found the whole extended Combs family missing. Across the family's 3 homes, doors and walls had been hoven in, and the blood and tumult which reigned within had sent the men running for Irvine. So paralyzed had the town been that only a few men went into the woods to look for the missing Combs clan, but not one corpse had been found, and traces had disappeared once the drying blood trailed into the tangled trees. This, then, was the problem they'd sent for me to solve. Zachary Walker, who'd been among the few to go searching that day, had a mind to pursue and kill the savage he assumed was in the woods himself. As he would readily attest to any who would listen, he'd tracked and killed many who made a habit of preying on westward frontiersmen as a youth in the wake of the Revolution. But he was old now, and in need of energetic help. Brom Van Dyer, shaken by last winter's grisly display in the branches of his own tree, felt obligated to lend what help he could as an experienced hunter. Thus, the two wished to tag along if I decided to stay on and take Clay up on his offer. I needed the money, but I needed the action more. Each time I wound my way home from the wilds with fresh memories of scalped mothers and scorched homesteads, I found the placid quiet of life as a struggling farmer an impossibility for me. I belonged in the thick of struggle, So great a part had violence played in my life until that point that I could scarce solve problems without it. Every day I was away from the western reaches of the continent, which themselves were woven further westward each year beneath the tread of hardy souls in search of prosperity, was another in which other men had to fight battles I was capable of fighting. Now, the knives and baleful gazes of those ravenous savages from the wastes who terrorized the frontier seemed at large in the heart of what should be tame country. So bloody was their grip on these ancient hills that it was imprinted on the minds of those who wandered through them, my own included. I accepted both the job and the aid. The more they told of the happenings in Irvine, the more convinced I was this was the job of a war band. No single man could weave the terror which skulked about the county, I reasoned. I'd need more hands than my own if I was to tangle with a nocturnal cadre of outcast Indians. Van Dyer nodded stoically as we concluded, his blue eyes seeming to glitter with nervous anticipation of what had to follow. Walker stood, clasped my hand a second time with all the strength of a great snake, and then demanded his host tell him where the whiskey of the house was kept, that he might refill his flask.